I started really spending time practicing scales and arpeggios and even gotten them to where I could use that in my solos and go beyond just playing pentatonic licks. But the first time I tried to learn a jazz standard, I failed completely and was pretty much doing everything wrong. At the time, I had no idea what a jazz standard was, and even if I had known that they were mostly songs written for musicals in the 30s and 40s, then I would probably just have run away screaming. And my introduction to jazz and jazz standards was really a bit odd. This is really just a story about me being clueless and fumbling around in the dark while making every possible mistake, so that hopefully you don't have to. At the time, I was still studying mathematics at the university, and I was hanging out with a bass player friend of mine that I knew from high school. I hadn't seen him for a few years, and we were jamming and improvising. And afterwards, he told me about jazz and played me some fusion albums. I wasn't really that impressed with the fusion stuff, because to me it sounded like instrumental pop music just with chorus on everything. The music I was listening to at the time was much more blues-based and really not produced like the 80s fusion stuff was. At the same time, I was still really curious to learn and try to play jazz because I wanted to become better at improvising. That part fascinated me because improvising was what I had the most fun doing when I was playing in rock bands, which I did next to studying at the university. And I was actually pretty lucky that I played in bands where I had a lot of space to improvise, especially given how bad it probably sounded. I had been checking out some Satriani and Steve Vai, but when I realized that they were not improvising their solos, I just quickly lost all interest in their music and went looking for other stuff. It actually took quite a long time until I started to appreciate their playing again. And it's really strange how some pretty random things can influence our taste. I somehow also ignored that a lot of the rock bands that I actually did listen to didn't really improvise either. Luckily, Johan, the bass player, had an Aebersold album that I could borrow so that I could try to learn to play. Now, if you don't know what an Aebersold album is, then it's a book with sheet music for some songs and backing tracks for those songs so that you have something to practice with. But of course, you do need to be able to read and interpret a lead sheet because that's what's in the book. At the time, I'd never listened to jazz, and the only jazz song I played was Mood Indigo, where I'd managed to teach myself a G7 flat 13, but I didn't have any solos. And I had absolutely no idea what to do with all the chords in the Aebersold book. The most jazzy song that I'd ever soloed on was probably T-Bone Walker's Stormy Monday, which is still just a 12-bar blues. I started listening to the Aebersold cassette, and the first song was Green Dolphin Street.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Now, of course, I only had the backing track, so I listened to the groove in the bass intro, which was actually a bit confusing, and especially the chords, which sounded amazing with a lot of color, and it was moving around in ways that I wasn't used to, which I found really interesting. I immediately set out to try and learn to improvise over that song. If you want to learn a song, then one of the first things that you want to do is to listen to that song. I guess it seems kind of obvious, right? When I'm working on a song, usually I'll check out several different versions and also try to figure out what the famous versions of that song is and make sure that I've listened to those as well. But here I was in a situation where I only had the backing track album. And this was in 1994 without any Spotify, YouTube or iTunes. So I had no idea how people played that song. Remember that I had no experience with listening to or playing jazz, and the only source of music that I had available was the library, where it was hard to find specific songs if you did not know what album it was on or who recorded it. Which is really a pity because the Coltrane Miles version of this song could probably have made things a lot easier. Now that I think about it, then in the Aebersold books there is actually a list of recorded versions of the different songs. But I didn't realize that that was something that I had to pay attention to, and it was just a list of a lot of names that I anyway didn't know because I didn't know any jazz artists. From the sheet music in the Aebersold book, then I could sort of spell my way through the melody, even though E-flat major was not exactly a key that I felt familiar with. This song and the melody was still certainly a challenge and something that I could at most just sort of spell my way through, not easily play. And this meant that I didn't really spend a lot of time on it, since I was anyway not really setting out to learn the melody. I wanted to improvise, I wanted to solo on the song. What I didn't know was that if you want to learn to improvise over a jazz standard, then one of the first things that you want to learn is the melody. And there are two main reasons for this. The melody is what you use to hear the harmony. So you hear the melody note, and from that note, you hear the rest of the chord around it. That's a lot easier than just hearing 4 beats of C minor 7, which I think you can hear is a very abstract thing to hear. The melody also gives you the form. So instead of counting bars while you're playing, you hear the melody as a guide through the form so that you don't get lost. Not having the melody internalized made this very, very difficult. Mainly, I then had to count to keep track of where I was in the song and in the chord progression. And the entire chord progression was anyway completely new to me. I'd never heard of a 2-5-1 or a 3-6-2-5. I actually think that I could have gotten a lot further if I had learned the melody first, but nobody told me that that was important, so I just tried to count and keep track of where I was, which turned out to be a very poor strategy. What really drew me to Green Dolphin Street was probably the shifting major 7th chords in the beginning of the song, and that was also what felt the easiest to solo on, or rather that felt possible to solo on. The first part of the song feels more modal and it's not really a typical jazz standard progression. The second 8 bars is a very typical progression because essentially that's just 2-2-5-1 progressions with alto dominance. But those were impossible for me to solo on because I didn't know what a 2-5-1 was, and I certainly had no vocabulary for that. And alto dominance, well, I knew what the scale was, but I couldn't really play it. The way I've been taught to improvise at this point was to look at a chord, figure out what scale to use, and then just play something with that scale. The skill of really spelling out the chord changes were not something that I was really aware of. Everything was per chord and not about playing specific chord progressions. The other approach that I knew was to just have one scale that fitted the entire song and then just use that. But I really couldn't find a scale that had an E flat major 7, a G flat major 7, an F major 7, and an E major 7 chord in there. I could barely figure out what to play on the chords, and I had no idea how to tie together those melodies. And then 200 beats per minute, which is how fast the backing track was, is pretty fast. Those parts of the songs were mostly just crash and burn, and often I would just get completely lost trying to count and play at the same time. And this is really why you want to learn some vocabulary and work on soloing over chord progressions like a 2-5-1 and a turnaround, because you'll be able to deal with the chords in blocks and not have to stress over each single chord in the song. It's going to help you work with it so that you don't have to think about what scale fits here and what can I play, and then the next chord is just gonna come along and ruin everything. The way I learned to improvise using chord-scale relationships is not that uncommon, and it's also sort of a logical next step if you deal with shorter progressions with not too many chords. And that means that if you want to transition into playing jazz, then the first songs that you're given by a teacher are probably going to be modal songs. And here modal songs are different chords next to each other with no real harmonic connection. Songs like Cantaloupe Island or So What are very typical examples. What is useful about learning improvisation like this is that the songs are easier to play over, so you don't have to think about a million chords, scales, and arpeggios. It helps develop a sense of period, so feeling the 1 of the bar and the 4 bar periods. And a lot of modal progressions have really distinct chord changes, so it's easier to hear when the chord changes and what is happening and where you are, which means that you don't get lost as easily. But they do have a problem if you want to later play songs like jazz standards and bebop themes. Jazz as a language was not developed by playing over a static chord for a long period of time. It was developed by improvising over jazz standards, which have faster moving progressions. And a part of that language is also how the solo incorporates those chords into the lines. You need to learn to think ahead and also to play a melody that spans several different chords. And that's really difficult if you're trained to think about everything one chord at the time and not have an overview of several chords in one phrase. In that way, many modal pieces don't really help you get better or build the material that you need if you want to transition into playing jazz standards. I didn't really succeed in playing something that you can actually call a solo on Green Dolphin Street, even though it is to this day still one of my favorite songs. And it wasn't until a year later that I took a different approach to learning that I started to internalize some songs. And an important part of learning this is using an exercise that I talk about in this video. Not only just to learn the song and play the changes, but also to develop some real jazz phrasing and stronger rhythms in your solos, you want to check out this video because it might be an eye-opener.